Good day and welcome to this tutorial on schemas. Today we're going to be looking at variables and how you can define variables within the schema, what they are essentially, how they can be used, how we can bind against them, etc. So here we are on this basic schema example. Previously we had just elements rendering, but I've cleaned that view up a little bit, and now all that we have is just this basic form with a welcome header, username label, and this input with username in it, and then this piece of text here which is mirroring whatever is in the input. Now these are all generated via the elements which I've spoken about before in a previous video, and then there's some binding on these elements that are binding against our variables. So for example, this basic form header here is not being bound by anything. This is just hard-coded text, whereas this welcome and username text that you're seeing here is being bound against some translations which are being defined within our variables. And then same with this input and this piece of text here, they're being bound against the same piece or the same variable. So for example, if I come in here and I change this now to some other value, let's say Joe, there you can see the text also updates along with whatever value is in here. So yeah, so let's go and take a look at how we define these variables and then how we can bind against them with our elements. So I'm just going to jump now to our schema. So here's our schema. So first thing to note is obviously the body, which is containing all of our elements. So here you can see here's that H2 that I was speaking about with the basic form hard-coded value here. And then let's go and look at the elements that are actually being bound against with our variables. So here you can see this H3 here is its content is coming from this path here. So we've got this @translations.welcome, and what this is essentially saying is saying variables dot translations.welcome. It's like a shorthand. I think it might even be schema dot variables dot translations. So it's just a shorthand to say @translations dot or @translations dot whatever value you have there. And so where is this value coming from? So if we look at the variables object, we've got this translations object, which in itself has two values. It has a welcome property and a username property. And here you can see translations.welcome. This is essentially saying go and fetch this value and stick it in here. And what this allows us is we can then go and define translations somewhere else in the system that will come into these keys and then replace this English version of welcome to whatever language that you may have set at the time. So, and you can't do that with hard-coded or pre-rendered HTML. So it just allows an easy way for you to, or a nice mechanism at least, to define translations or things like translations. So let's just undo that. Right, so yeah, there's how our translation is being brought into this H3, and then it renders, as you saw, as just welcome. And the same thing goes for this label as well. So you can see @translations.username, it goes and fetches this, translations.username, this value here, and sticks it into the content of this label. So same example as before. Now let's go take a look at a bit more of an interesting example with the input and the text that is being updated. So as I showed here, we can go and update this input here, and the associated text, or this text as well, also updates in line with that. And this is making use of the binding engine. So we're using CRS schema firstly to bring in the schema functionality of being able to define our JSON and render the JSON and pass the JSON and create our elements and manage the variables and so on. And then we've got CRS binding, which, like if you've used the binding engine before, you'll see similar kind of syntax being used or utilized here. So we can bring that functionality into our schemas as well. If you're not too familiar with binding, don't stress. I think it's just important to realize that when we say something like aria label.bind or value.bind, we're essentially saying listen to this property and bind the value or the changes, or whenever this property changes, then go and perform some actions or update this element accordingly. So, for example, we've got this data.username here, which is now we're not focusing on translations anymore. It's at variables.data.username. So it's going to grab this value initially and stick it in here. But now, because we're binding against it, you'll see whenever we make an update to this input, because we're binding against the value, it will then go and update the associated property on our variables. So let's go take a look at that. So if I just refresh, you can see it comes in as Kieran Riley as the default. And then if we change this to some other value and then go and look at the schema, so let me just open up the data properties and get a handle on my form here. Right, so let's go see the schema. Well, there you can see, here's our variables, there's data, and there you can see data is being updated to whatever we're placing in this input, right? So if I didn't mean to refresh there. Well, you can see it again here, so let me just grab that again. Right, so it's back to Kieran Riley, and if I say test, for example, and we go and check the variable again, well, there you can see it's updated to test. And so we can now update or change the values, bind against those values and see the changes come in. And the same thing goes for this paragraph tag. So this content is also binding against the same data.username in this case. And because we're dealing with text and so on, we have to use this template literal or string literal syntax that the binding engine utilizes to say, okay, listen for changes along this path and update the text or the content accordingly. And so that's why when we update this guy, this text also updates. Yeah, so a bit of a basic example, but you can see how we can utilize variables to store information for us and then go and set that information on elements, and then we'll start to look at more complex examples moving forward. But yeah, thank you for watching.